Friends! Romans!
Countrymen.
I know!
Well, get on with it then.
Matron, take them away.
By the mid-1960s, Kenneth Williams' flared nostrils, elastic vocal cords and distinct brand of comic hysteria had made him a unique performer.
I'll get on to it right away.
Nowhere more so than in the Carry On films.
Put something on, you filthy beast. There's nothing to be afraid of. Oh, I don't know, though.
Yes, it will hurt, Mr. Smith, and I want it to hurt. Perhaps next time you consider having a lump, you'll think twice about it.
As the years went on, he dispensed with characters and co-stars. He didn't need scripts. He became his own material. Kenneth Williams was more on show than ever before.
Naval displays, Kenneth, starting now.
The finest naval display you would ever see is when I get out my navel. They shoved me in this hospital. They put a tube up the rear. Quite ghastly.
His act was an excavation of his own self, digging deeper into his own soul, brooding about his bowels.
My bowels?
And making us laugh.
Okay now?
Not really, no. I suffer very badly from wind.
He became a caricature of himself, I think.
I'm very mean myself. Burglar alarm on the dustbin, I'm not...
The performance didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. All of Williams' life became an act.
You saw this figure imprisoned in his own set of narrative tricks and his desire to show off and to amuse you and to reach you. You could see also that it was a performance and in a deep sense a desperate one.
You're extremely well-read, extremely intelligent, and yet you are, in a sense, expected to behave all the time like some kind of outraged dowager, you know.
He was hugely dissatisfied with the kind of person he was. And I think that was the problem. He didn't like himself, and I think that had he been acclaimed as the greatest Shakespearean actor since Burton, or had he made a career as a sex symbol, and there would still have been, he would still have been an unhappy man. I think that was his, in his soul.
London in the mid-60s was the place to be. The capital was swinging and change was in the air, but Kenneth Williams looked unlikely to play any part in it. Conservative of dress, lifestyle and habits, he seemed a figure out of step with the times. But his outer conformity hid a fascination with the new sexual freedoms of the age.
It was swinging London. And Kenneth was always incredibly immaculately dressed. He was a very smart little chap. And he had a furled umbrella, I remember, and he was on the back of my Lambretta on the pillion. He always used to sit rather straight on the pillion. And in those times, you could go round Eros. And for some reason, I thought, I'll go round Eros, so I felt a bit high. And Kenneth suddenly started shouting, waving this umbrella, saying, where's it all happening? Where are all these orgies? Why haven't we been asked?
Williams' wish to be part of the action was answered in 1964 when he met one of the most anarchic and flamboyant figures of the age, the playwright Joe Orton, who just caused outrage with his first West End hit, entertaining Mr. Sloane.
When I was with him in life, I found myself laughing so much of the time. He was terribly funny. I mean, often he was a very impish and outrageous kind of wit.
Like Williams, Orton was gay, working class, and a prodigious diarist. Unlike Williams, Orton revelled in his sexuality. He lived with his long-term lover, Kenneth Halliwell, and sought sexual adventure at every opportunity.
The freedom of his humor, the freedom of himself, is what so appealed to Williams, who was so unfree in himself physically and intellectually. He was bound by convention and under wraps. And even if Williams couldn't in himself be unabashed, he could be part of someone's story who was unabashed, and that was liberating.
I remember one escapade in Leicester. He revisited Leicester and said that we couldn't go to my parents' house. So he took this bloke in instead to the porch, which was the only part that remained of a derelict house. And he said that having sex in this porch was peculiarly difficult because the circumstances were very confined. And he said, my bum was outside most of the time and it was freezing.
But Orton wanted his friend to do more than take vicarious pleasure in his exploits. As his diary reveals, he urged Kenneth to shed his inhibitions and become more like him.
I'm basically guilty about being homosexual, you see, he said. Then you shouldn't be, I said. Get yourself fucked if you want to. Get yourself anything you like. Reject all the values of society and enjoy sex. When you're dead, you'll regret not having fun with your genital organs.
The friendship worked both ways. Orton was flattered by the attentions of a big star and loved his show business world.
The Eamon Andrews Show.
With Kenneth's encouragement, he began to make guest appearances on TV game shows and chat shows.
And tonight, Eamon's guests are Bernard Braden, Barbara Kelly, Ava Gabor, Joe Orton, The Bachelors,
Joe Orton.
Welcome, Joe. Well, as I was saying, you're a very successful writer. Now, but what about this business of spending 6 months in jail? It's something to do with library books, hasn't it?
Yes, I used to take lots of books out of the library, and I used to smuggle them out in a satchel, and then I used to sort of paste a picture over the picture of the author. I remember one of them was by Lady Lewisham, a book on etiquette, actually, and I painted a picture of, or pasted a picture of, a great nude woman cut from a nude book. People must have been very surprised.
At heart, Williams and Orton were cut from the same cloth.
I wasn't giving myself airs at all.
Both were highly intelligent and determined to prove themselves in the eyes of the world.
Well, I didn't do it just on one book, I did it on hundreds.
They always looked like two delinquent schoolboys to me. Both of them rejoicing in one another's schoolboy cleverness. And both needed success and didn't want unsuccess at any price.
Orton was determined his new friend would star in his latest play, Loot, and cast him as the worldly and brutal Inspector Truscott. Williams was thrilled to be back on the stage in a work by the country's hottest new writer, but their first and only collaboration ended in disaster. The play died a death during its provincial tour and never made it to the West End.
We were at Bournemouth, and one usherette was reported as saying that it was unnecessarily filthy, as if there really was a necessary amount of filth.
People were emptying the auditorium all the time, you know, with that production, because we came under the watch committee in Manchester because we hadn't got the seal of the Lord Chamberlain, and we had policemen in the wings saying, if you say that line, the watch committee are banning that line, if you say that line, because the policeman had to say, where do you do it? Where the streets are well lit, there are no open spaces, where do you do it? 5 pregnancies in 1 week, where have you done it? And the boy had to say, on crowded dance floors during the rumba. And they said it was a definite aspersion and rudeness about the local dance halls.
The offence the play caused was not the only problem. The cast couldn't find a playing style that worked, and no one was struggling more than Kenneth Williams.
Although Kenneth was in love with the play, it seemed to me, as we proceeded with the rehearsals, that he was wrongly cast.
I saw it on its last night. I knew that it was meant to be a comedy, and it wasn't making anybody laugh. And Kenneth was, I don't know, I suppose he was just desperate. He was doing a send-up of something or other, but he was going into many different characters while he was supposedly playing this detective.
After the show, I felt so suicidally depressed, I just don't know what to do. The utter shambles of this production is totally unbelievable. The cast is demoralized and the script practically in rags, and some of it complete nonsense. I wish I'd never set foot near the rotten mess of it all.
Orton had failed to revive Williams' stage career, but he did transform his private world. In the summer of 1966, Orton and Halliwell took Williams on holiday to a place that would change his life. Tangier, in the 1960s, was a haven for gay men, drawn there by the availability of sexual partners in a society tolerant of unconventional lifestyles.
Orton took to it like Pinocchio at the fair, you know? I mean, Orton really could get into it, loved it, was sensual, was young, muscular, worked on his body.
Typically, Williams approached the Tangier experience with more restraint. Barry Wade met him on his first trip there.
We'd wear all his full clothes, suit, tie, jacket, and sit on the beach. Completely dressed. We're not going to take my clothes off in front of the sun. But we would all go swimming, and Kenneth would have a few drinks and plonk himself into a deck chair and go to sleep. Rather like that, as you can see. He might take a jacket off if it got too hot. That's about as far as you'd get, I think. He would complain bitterly all the time and thoroughly enjoyed it.
But while the temptations Tangier offered unsettled him, Williams couldn't resist completely.
He came to the villa. I used to rent a villa there for 3 months. And he loved all that, to come up to the villa. A couple of parties. Complain about them, of course. I shouldn't be here. It's immoral, the whole place. Jump on the back of a bike with a Moroccan and drive off.
Eventually, he took me to a sleazy apartment house in the Medina, where a Spanish queen with an ill-fitting toupee showed us into a wretched chamber for 15 dirham. I'll have another bit of that tomorrow.
He'd disappear. Where have you been, Kenneth? Mind your business. So, you weren't expecting to get any information at all.
Even there, where the freedom was almost encouraged, it's part of the local industry to have this kind of sexual freedom. He was retiring to hotel rooms deep in the souk, you know, in the Casbah, the very darkest corners he could find.
It all happened out of sight, and then he could still say, I'm celibate, I don't do anything. So you say, yes, Kenneth.
In Tangier, Williams could skirt the fringes of a world that both repelled and fascinated him. It offered an escape from his unhappy life at home, and, as these previously unpublished photographs reveal, somewhere that he could relax and feel part of life.
On all the occasions, I fled to Morocco because of some inner despair. There wasn't one really successful visit in the sense of spiritual replenishment, but they all worked after a fashion because new rhythms were created and the pendulum must swing. It's when the pendulum is motionless or barely moving at all, that is the time of suicidal despair.
But the relationship that helped create these new rhythms was cut tragically short. On August the 9th, 1967, Kenneth Halliwell beat his lover Joe Orton's brains out with a hammer. He then took 22 sleeping tablets to kill himself. The loss of his friends confirmed for Williams the danger of following Orton's sexual creed.
There's no question about it. It is a homosexual entanglement that does destroy Joe. There's no question about that. I mean, Halliwell's jealousy, I mean, his letter at the end says the answer to this can be found in the diaries. And the diaries of Joe were entirely accounts of promiscuous sex.
No, please. Oh, no, please, no, I cannot, not before a meal.
But one area of Williams' life was unfailingly successful. His role as a carry-on star.
S-E-T. S-E-T. Sex. Enjoyment tax.
Audiences loved their bawdy humour. And the series fast became the most successful in British cinema history. During the 1960s, Pinewood Studios were turning out up to 3 a year, most featuring Kenneth Williams.
You maniac!
The films are British, with a capital B. If you actually analyse them, very, very daring. it was all innuendo and totally acceptable, really.
Oh, excellent. Well done, matron.
Well, it seems a little bit rickety, Doctor.
Is it? Yes, well, of course, it's fairly easy to get it up. It's getting it to stay up. That's what counts.
One of the reasons that he was so loyal to the Carry On films is that so often what he gave in the theatre, people said, we want less of this. And with the Carry Ons, they said, we want more of this. And the audiences liked it too. So he had a hit on his hands, and we all would rather like a hit.
Do not worry, we'll make it easy for them. They will die the death of 1,000 cats.
Oh, no. Well, that's horrible.
Nonsense, child. The British are used to cats.
You're playing the part of an Indian...
I am playing, yes, Randy Lal, the Qazi. He is the sort of Rajah, you see, who's anti-British in this.
Do you think that this is the type of part you like acting?
Oh, I always do. It's got a touch of the sadism in it, you see, and I'm very good at all that, being a bit nasty, you know.
Yes.
Enjoy that very much.
They didn't want characters. They wanted the essence of what you had. So Kenny was like himself.
Do you think I'm an idiot? You wouldn't dare do anything to me, and you know it.
He was very snooty, very grand, very erudite.
I'll cut his two-faced pipe.
He used to mug around and joke around, and he did that in the film.
You're wasting your time. You can't do anything to frighten me.
Come on, then. Turn him over on his side.
He brought a kind of restrained anarchy. You never quite knew what he would do next. The others, Hattie Jakes, Sid James, you knew exactly what they were going to do.
Are you all right? Am I all right? Of course I'm all right.
But you watched Kenneth because at that time, he could suddenly surprise you in a very ordinary scene.
Yes, I'm fine.
I wouldn't say he was over the top, but he got near the brink. And that's what he enjoyed. He enjoyed that immensely.
Always putting the oar in.
Williams gave as much a performance off the set as he did in front of the cameras.
He liked to gather people round him and tell stories. The whole cast and all the staff and even public who were watching would be waiting for him to set up his stall to tell stories. It was like the Pied Piper.
Typical of Kenneth Williams' sense of humour, the mayoress of Wolverhampton came on the set one morning, and he was introduced to her and immediately went into a story that he does very well and tells everybody. And there is a tape of it where he's playing it with Bernard Cribbins as the doctor, and you may like to hear it.
Oh, Doctor.
Good morning.
Good morning, Doctor.
Morning. Sit down.
Oh, thank you. I must see you, Doctor. It's terribly important.
What seems to be the trouble?
Well, you see, it's this wind all the time. It's dreadful with my work, you see. I'm losing jobs, you see.
What is your job?
I'm a shorthand typist.
Well, is it anything to do with diet, you suppose?
No, I eat anything. I eat all the time. Oh, you know, anything, cornflakes and porridge.
Well, I think I'd better just examine you. And there's no sort of side effects, are there, with these?
Oh, well, the only thing is, Doctor, though there's the noise, there's no smell.
Oh,
that's
yes,
right.
yeah.
Here, you're not going to put that thing up my bum.
Well, no, I'm going to stick it up your nose, because if you think they don't smell, it's your nose wants to see into, isn't it?
That was mild.
There was little Williams wouldn't do to attract attention to himself.
This Roman tunic I'm wearing in the film is really quite attractive, in white and gold.
Just a minute. Give me a chance to look all sexy.
I continually lift it up and expose my cock and everything at the unit.
Come in.
They're all rather disgusted and laugh it off.
Evening, Cock. Thanks, Cock. I'll be ready.
But quite a number of them have remarked, "Oh, Kenny, not again. Put it away."
There was this very old lady walking up the street, and Kenny decided he would spend a penny in police uniform into a drain in the road. She came along and saw him spending a penny, a policeman. She went, oh my dear, and she just tore off down the road.
You old baked witch, you!
The restaurant was full of people, and when he came in, he used to say, "Hello, Giovanni. Nice to see you. Have you had a wank this morning?"
Charmed, I'm sure.
But the impulse behind these antics was a desperate one. He could be appalled by his own behaviour, but the reaction it generated filled an emotional gap in his life.
When I think of the shameless way I behave, anything for a cheap laugh, the dirty mimes, the dirty songs, and the obscene dialogue, and the person that I really am at home with myself, it is almost a Jekyll and Hyde existence, and the first half gives me guilt and remorse. The obvious remedy is to stop the lewd behavior, but then I'm loath to relinquish the laughs and the crowd that gathers about me. I need them like other healthy people need the affection of a partner.
Kenneth has, when he comes into a room, has to create excitement around himself. Not so much for the other people as for himself, so that he's stimulated. Because what he doesn't want to be is bored. Because there's a well of emptiness in that human being who needs stimulating, who needs calling out of the sort of depression that is the basic state of his existence.
I remember him coming to pubs. I remember Ted Smith, and he used to stand at bars saying,
And I told him, I said, you're not getting nothing out of me, mate. You're getting nothing. All the comedians I've known have been deeply depressive. People are manic depressive. The moments when you talk to them, you realise what a colossal amount of despair was underneath the facade which they desperately kept it at bay with. They kept it at bay with this facade. It felt their duty to channel a private misery into comedy.
I suspect he was a prisoner perpetually of the persona that he knew elicited the response of hilarity and of approval. He was almost insatiable in his desire for your finding him risible and funny.
Oh, lovely.
There was something orgasmic about the effect he wanted in you, hearing the story. I mean, he wanted that above all, to build something to a great climax of crescendo of laughter and outrageousness. And then he would sort of fall silent.
I did used to get concerned about him sometimes, and I used to try to say, are you happy, and whatever. But he didn't really want to talk about that. I mean, I was having counselling at one time, and he thought that was ghastly in case it took away his creativity. He felt it would destroy something in him. He felt it would stop him being what he was.
Ladies and gentlemen, your star and host for tonight, Kenneth Williams.
In the late 60s, Williams found a new channel for his comedy, television. He became the compere of a new BBC Two variety show.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of International Cabaret, the United Nations of the entertainment world, where the sari meets the sweater, the kimono meets the kilt, the brassiere meets the bowler. And says, you go on ahead while I'll give these two a lift.
Williams would go down in broadcasting history for his efforts to reduce the fee he was offered for the show. He thought it was too much for too little.
I had a private word with Bill Cotton about my salary on TV and told him I thought it was excessive.
I offered him the rate for the job.
That's an awful lot of money.
And he said, oh, I couldn't possibly accept that. That's far too much money. Eventually I said, look, I won't talk money to you. I mean, I'll talk it to your agent. And, he said, oh, don't talk to him. He'll talk me into taking it. I mean, I said, well, that's his job, you know.
Ladies and gentlemen, from England, our own, the K system.
In International Cabaret, Williams became television's first high camp host. The programme was meant to be a showcase for international talent, but it was Williams' monologues between the acts that soon became the show's real star turn.
Every time she gets that bit about at the third stroke.
The audience for the show started off as being an ordinary ticket audience, but it soon got round that this was something that was a bit unusual.
He said, "Shut up!" I started crying. And he bashed me right across the face. And he said, "Pull yourself together. Do you want everyone to think you're a sissy?" I said, "Oh, no. I don't want them to think that." He said, "Well, put away that scented handkerchief."
Then it started to build an audience of gay people.
I've had it hard.
They were very appreciative of this type of performance.
Yes, I have, dear. You have too, have you?
And showed it by enormous bursts of laughter and applause. And of course, Kenny Williams lived on that. He thought that was wonderful.
But underneath his brash stage act, Williams' private fears persisted, even after the legalization of homosexual acts in 1967. His rare forays into the gay scene were clumsy and uncertain.
The only gay club I ever remember seeing Kenneth in the early days was the Spartan Club in Victoria. And actually, he wouldn't go until he was probably had a few drinks. And then he probably would overdo it and be over the top.
Went to the Spartan. I was bawling and shouting mutual masturbation to everyone. Most of them said, "No, thank you."
The central relationship in his life was still with his mother, Louis. And in 1972, they moved into adjacent flats. They went almost everywhere together, took regular holidays on cruise ships, and shared a sense of humour.
She was very funny, great with the repartee, and she had wonderful sayings of her own. But she also used to borrow phrases from Kenneth, and sometimes the dialogue between them was really quite entertaining.
But their conversation could be so uninhibited that friends were left speechless.
When we first had Kenneth here with Louis, he was leaving and said, "I must take her home now and rub her tits with olive oil." And we thought, does he always talk like this to his mother? And if you said to Kenneth, "Really, Kenneth, you can't talk like that to your mother," Louis would interrupt and say, "Don't you worry about my Ken."
The impressive store of general knowledge that Williams had acquired during his drive to educate himself finally found a public outlet in 1968. He was invited to appear on Just a Minute, the radio game show in which panelists talk for 1 minute on a given subject without hesitation, deviation or repetition.
I think Just a Minute was one of his favourite jobs, because not only could he show off and ad-lib and be impromptu and have this sort of rapport with the audience. It gave him a wonderful means of expression for his comedy work and also to show off his erudition and learning.
The subject is stopping hiccups. Can you tell us something about that in this game starting now?
One of the best tips I can give you is to inhale deeply and then recite a long piece, such as the old order changes the replaced new, and God fulfills himself in many ways as one good custom should corrupt the world. Comfort thyself, what comfort is in me? I have lived my life, and that which I have done may he with himself may feel, but thou.
Peter Jones, the challenge.
You'd be better off with the hiccups.
So, before the programme started, Kenneth wouldn't go, "Hello, I don't like all this, oh no, I'm a cult, everybody knows, stick his bottom right out. I'm a cult, I'm a great big cult, I'm the biggest cult in the whole of the BBC, and they come and sit down. Kenneth always sat here, Freud there, Peter Jones there, myself over there, and as the programme started, and Freud might be talking in his very slow, lugubrious way, I took this dog out for a walk yesterday. Kenneth, by this time, would have his trousers rolled up and be flaunting his leg under Freud's nose and Freud's face, and then go over and nuzzle him up against his beard, stroking him, and Freud would still go on without being interrupted at all, in a very slow way, looking straight ahead as though Kenneth didn't exist. Now, Kenneth, by this time, would be looking at his mother. She always sat 2 rows back in exactly the same seat.
Lovely, oh, wonderful.
And however rude he might be, everything went straight to his mother.
He was ejaculating like mad there.
If the show was going poorly, he would be looking up at the box, and he could tell when the audience weren't with it. And he would look up at the box to me, and I would simply go like that, and Ken would take his cue, and off he'd go, and he'd say, I haven't come here all the way from...
and I'm not here to be made fun of. Do you think I'm some object of ridicule? Do you think that's what I am?
And he'd get the audience absolutely falling about, and he'd keep looking at the box, and if I went down, he'd sit down and start playing the game again. So he could lift it any time he liked. I've never come across an artist who could pick up 250 people like that and drop them like that at his own whim. It was wonderful.
Keeping a stiff upper lip starting now.
I have actually tried this myself, and inevitably one comes to resemble a ventriloquist dummy.
Just a Minute was more than just a game show to Williams. It was his chance to show a side of himself that he really cared about. And his anger at being contradicted was often all too real.
On that subject, and that is the subject.
Well, it's the subjects you're supposed to discuss, you great fool!
What sound as if they start off as fantasy rages end up sounding more like real rages, and those performances were quite strange sometimes because you felt, should this be being broadcast? This is too authentic to be entertainment anymore.
It is a rope.
He was giving an example of how this word...
Carbuckle is a rope. It can't be a knot. It's a rope. It's got to go up and down. A knot can't go up and down. What are you talking about? A knot's for tying, you great nit.
But in real life, Williams could be far ruder and far angrier.
I remember once a friend of mine from the country said, "Oh, Kenneth, how nice to see you. What are you doing now?" What am I doing? I happen to be appearing with Ingrid Bergman at the Cambridge Theatre. You bald-headed country bumpkin.
There was something desperate to come out of Kenneth, or was something inside him. And so his defense mechanism was to attack.
He said outrageous things, awful things, cruel things, vicious things. He may have meant them at the time, he may not have meant them at the time, he may not have meant them 3 minutes later. And that you had to know and accept. He could say ghastly, impossible things to you, use the foulest language. But don't worry about it, because the next morning it was all over. Indeed, the next minute it was possibly all over. But some people found it too much to take.
He was glad to have been as bad as he was sometimes, because at least he was imposing himself on the world in that way. He wasn't being its victim. He had become a formidable presence in some way, and people would look at that and they'd think, gosh, this is a sort of person that we don't otherwise come across.
Even members of the public could find themselves at the receiving end of a Williams outburst. He related one such incident in a message left on a friend's answer phone.
I did that just a minute yesterday. Oh, it was awful. Some dreadful man came up onto the stage after and said, "Do you fulfill the strictures of Lord Reith, who said that everything should be for the greater glory of Christianity?" I said, "Oh, shut up." I said, "People like you wear me out." And he said, bless you, my son, God's bless." I said, "Don't give me that crap. I don't want to hear it. I will pray for you." I said, "Don't bother. As your presence here today has been embarrassing. You cause nothing but vexation, like so many of your religious friends."
Williams grew to hate the attention he received from the public in the street, regarding it as a painful intrusion into his privacy.
I feel the bleeding going on inside. Every day I die more consciously. The staring, the stopping in the street, the nudging of people when they recognize me, my fear of them, my hate of them, my desire to get away from their prying eyes.
His efforts to escape prying eyes could result in some bizarre behavior, especially in restaurants.
When I arrived, I couldn't see him anywhere in this quite crowded restaurant. And he had waiters construct around the table, I don't know, kind of series of screens. And when you went into the little screened area, it was shut, as it were, so that you two were alone in what was like a kind of tent. And outside, the noise of this very busy restaurant. He didn't want to be looked at.
Although one part of Williams shrank from public curiosity, his ego needed reassuring that he had been recognised.
This is Biagge's, one of Kenneth's favourite restaurants. Came here many times with him. Used to bring all of his show business friends here. And Kenny always used to ask for this table over in the corner, where he used to sit with his back to the room. Because he said, I don't want to be bothered with people, I just want to be left alone to have a quiet evening with my friends. But of course that was impossible with Kenneth, because as the evening went on and the stories got louder, and as he began to entertain everybody, so the whole room would join in and became like a great big party.
We were going somewhere quiet, somewhere in the Fulham Road, I think it was. Because it was quiet, he said. And it was quiet until Kenneth started. Go on! We got halfway through the meal. Everybody in the restaurant knew who it was.
Miss Fosdick really looks quite gay, doesn't she?
And as soon as he'd got them all in his grasp, he said, oh, come on, I'm fed up with this. Can't stand these people. And we left halfway through the meal.
Williams owed his high public profile to the Carry On films, but their success was trapping him in a stereotype.
His tragedy, in a way, was he was too clever for the material, and he knew he was repeating himself. He knew that he was doing really a lot of inferior stuff in among the good work.
What do you want?
The one who calls himself Dandy Desmond.
That's him.
He was insulted by every script he was sent because he thought nobody understood that he was really a much better actor.
Which one of you is looking for Big Dick?
He is.
I turned to the shooting script of the Carry On, which arrived yesterday. If anything, it is worse than the previous version. It is appalling. It lacks verbal wit, it lacks comic situation, it lacks any credible characters. It is a carry-on.
Anybody who starts with Orson Welles must have a tremendous sense of what's possible. And then to finish up in, Carry On number 42 is not really a career move upwards.
Your days are numbered. Beware the Ides of March!
Oh, shut up, you silly old faggot.
He felt trapped by his voice, by what he did, by the fact that everybody just said, oh, go on, do a Kenneth Williams.
In 1971, 6 years after Loot, Williams returned to the theatre, desperate to wipe out the memory of that notorious flop and to re-establish himself on the stage. He starred with Ingrid Bergman and Joss Ackland in Shaw's Captain Brassbound's Conversion, which did good box office but had very mixed reviews. Then came a bittersweet comedy, My Fat Friend. The play opened well, and Williams' performance was much praised. He was ecstatic, as a letter he wrote at the time reveals.
The joy, the utter vindication of all the suffering and the dreary days when you see one rewarding notice which treats you seriously and talks not only about your comic persona, but about your ability to create pathos as well.
But even in a success, Williams couldn't prevent his comic persona from taking over.
The play became for him a sort of straitjacket in which he wasn't allowed to break out and be himself and be as funny as he could be. And what he wanted to do more than anything was to contact his audience.
Contacting his audience meant only one thing. Kenneth Williams, the comedy actor, became Kenneth Williams, the comic solo turn.
We'd been a duologue here, Kenneth and I, and perhaps they weren't laughing as they should do out there. Kenneth's getting very worried. So he leaves me and he dances down in this little sidling way, and I think, oh no, I know what's going to happen now. And he'd turn to the audience and say, hello, how are you? The house would go up. And he was there for about 4 minutes. Little quips and jokes, laugh building. He felt better. And so back he'd come as if nothing had happened. And he'd turn to me and he'd say, your turn.
Williams eventually bowed out of the production on the grounds of ill health, causing an early closure.
From the same place? Yeah, roughly.
Apart from a spell directing 2 of Joe Orton's plays in the early 80s, he had little contact with the theatre again. his career seemed stalled. When Round the Horn ended in 1969, the BBC had tried developing new television and radio programmes around him, but most, like the Kenneth Williams Show, were short-lived. And the high camp style he'd made his own was now being done by others, as his agent would explain.
Peter Eade telephoned. We talked about why there had been no offers of work of any kind, and he pointed out that the Grayson TV show is a complete crib of my stuff,
Cut off its tentacles. Well, the lifeguard was deaf. And you?
and that Inman is doing the same thing on the BBC.
Yes, I'm free, Captain Peacock.
It hadn't hit me before. Of course, they found other people to do it, and cheaper people in every sense.
It's all done in the best possible taste.
He was overtaken. In fact, he was furious with Kenny. Kenny Everett sort of went a bit further than Kenneth.
I'm really wanted by big people, and so many times.
There were people that sort of overtook Kenneth in that field, and towards the middle and the end of his life, he was probably a bit old-fashioned.
I have gone to apply for this job as a sports commentator. I'm walking right round the room now. I'm walking right round the room. I'm approaching the chair.
The waspishness increased. He became a little bit more difficult to be with, that people were a little bit frightened of him, that they couldn't find a vehicle for his talents.
How's that? Very good indeed, Mr. Rankin. The unfortunate part is we don't have a vacancy for a sports commentator at the moment, I'm afraid.
And I think increasingly he felt the shadows closing over him.
Oh, are you kidding?
But Williams held the shadows at bay once more. He began doing for the public what he'd been doing for years in private, making people laugh by talking about himself. The 1970s and 80s saw the heyday of the television chat show, and Williams became its king.
His way with words is legendary.
He is the most English of any of the Englishmen I've ever met so far.
A wasp with adenoids.
A brilliant talker that is also unfailingly funny.
Oh, Gary, stop acting it out.
Yeah, shall we bring him on now, I reckon?
Please.
The sublime Mr. Kenneth Williams.
Kenneth Williams.
Mr. Kenneth Williams. Kenneth Williams was God's gift to the talk show host. He was a huge show-off, and he loved making people A, shocked, and B, laugh.
When I first worked with Maggie Smith, we went to Fortnum and Mason, where she was after a particular kind of bra. A very grand assistant in Fortnum's, which was heavy carpeting, beautiful, very soft pile. You hardly heard as you entered. This woman said, yes, I have a particular bra, Ma'am. And she said it was 7 guineas. And Mag said, 7 guineas for a bra? Cheaper to have your tits off.
Any chat show host who wanted to have an insurance, on the panel, somebody who he knew was going to work, would ask Kenneth.
We don't want any saveloys tonight, thank you.
He was a wonderful raconteur. I mean, at his best, he was unsurpassing good. He had every range of equipment that you need to the person to appear on a talk show. He got a fabulous memory for stories. He had a great gift of invention. In other words, if he didn't have a good story, he'd make one up. And thirdly, of course, and most importantly, he was the most wonderful mimic.
I remember I was in a dressing room, completely private, I thought, and a knock came at the door, and I said, oh, is it? And the voice said, Noel, and I thought it was the stage manager, and I said, piss off, or something. And instead of which, the door opened, and Noel Coward came in. I was sitting on this chamber pot because I had this warm water with which I was cleaning myself. And I shot up, and in shooting up, when I saw him, I upset the Po and the water. The water went all over the place, and he said, what on earth are you doing? And I said, well, I was washing myself because I was told by the surgeon after my operation that I should never use toilet paper ever, but always wash it, completely wash it, you see. And he said, oh, my dear, I do understand. Have you read my book, Present Indicative? I discussed that very operation myself. It's a dreadful operation, Piles. And I said, no. I didn't have that. I said, no, my operation was for papilli. I had papilli, you see. And he said, papilli? My dear, it's an island in the South Seas. And in actual fact, it is.
I always thought with Kenneth that what he was like at times, he was like a jazz musician going off on a riff, on an improvisation. You'd ask him a question which would immediately alert the mind to other possibilities, and if he got a laugh, then he'd go. And the problem was stopping him. I mean, I think he actually did hold the record. I think he spoke for 15 minutes without interruption after I'd asked one question.
This was when I was with Edith Evans in a play called Gentle Jack, and the hotel left a meal for us because everyone else ate at, I suppose, 7 to 8, but we didn't get back till the curtain came down, so it was very late. And she sat there looking miserably at this cold collation, which really was curling at the edges. It wasn't at all appetizing. And this old retainer, who was sort of doubling as hall porter on the desk and waiting on table because everyone else had gone, it was so late, stumbled in, and he went up to her very familiarly and said, "Do you want to drop a wine?" And she said, "Oh, it's a half bottle of Beaujolais, would not come amiss." I thought you'd fancy a drop. And made these terrible leering looks at her. And then he turned to the sideboard to get this bottle of wine. And as he turned, he broke wind with ferocious. And it was really quite terrible. I mean, no offense, no attempt to cover. Sort of said, and then Dame Edith turned to me and she said, "This place has gone off, tell her."
You've just broken the record, Kenneth. You set yourself on this show. You just answered a question longer than anybody else.
Williams didn't just tell funny stories. He sometimes used the chat show as a political platform. The idealistic young Labour voter had become a passionate and vocal right-winger, and as strike action intensified in the mid-70s, something of a union basher.
And yet they can all get worked up over a couple of pound in their pay packet or something and go on strike. Why can't, I mean, if unions really care, if they're really socialistic and say we care about our fellow man, why can't they march about something like that? Instead of another pound for themselves. Why don't do a job just for what you get? You do the job because you want to do it well.
Oh, but Kenneth, can I say I think that's crap? I mean, I'm sorry. I've
never been so insulted.
Williams' forthright outburst caused a stir, and the following week he was invited back to argue his case with a heavyweight adversary, the trade union leader Jimmy Reed. Williams couldn't resist the challenge and entered the contest determined to come out on top.
Kenneth was incredibly competitive, and he regarded anybody else on the show with him as being somebody who was about to steal his thunder, and he would do anything to put them down. And I said to Kenneth, just give me a bit of sound level. This is before the show started, to do a sound test. And he stood up and declaimed this poem to the assembled staff, and then sat down and looked challengingly at Jimmy Reed, who said, "Was that Yeats?" And Kenneth said, "As a matter of fact, it was, yes." And so I said then to Jimmy Reed, "Jimmy," I said, "will you give me a bit of voice?" He said, "I've got a poem for you." And he did this extraordinary poem. And at the end of it, he turned to Kenneth, he said, "Who wrote that?" And Kenneth said, "I don't know." And Jimmy said, "I did." Now, I've never seen Kenneth as discomforted during an interview, or the interview that followed, as then. And I think that's probably the worst performance he ever did on a talk show that I did with him.
The ordinary working man's caught in the same trap because they'll say to him, "Ask more for your house, because if you want a better one, you won't get it unless you ask more." You know what I mean? So he's caught in the same trap, isn't he? The ordinary little man who owns a house, I mean.
Not particularly.
Well, he is, if he owns...
I'm telling you. No,
well, he is. He's caught in a trap because he must, if he's going to provide...
The talk show performances mattered to Williams because he was doing little else. In 1979, he played in the last of the Carry On films, with few regrets.
I will make you love me if it's the last thing I do.
As the Carry On films reached their climax, they became almost caricatures of themselves and coarsened, and the last one, which I know Kenneth thought was appalling, was Carry On Emmanuel. He was quite embarrassed to have done it, but he did it out of loyalty to the Carry On team, Carry On Emmanuel.
The film work had dried up, the stage work had dried up, the Kenneth Williams Presents on BBC television or whatever it might be, that had kind of gone. And he had become that most forlorn of creatures. He'd become the person who existed because of game shows and talk shows.
So from an enormous potential, he had reduced himself, boxed himself into a corner. And in a way, the same thing, I think, happened with his, in a sense, much of his private life. He alienated his friends as the years went by outrageous behavior. I mean, I remember being in the sitting room, and he'd kept the table on a raw for several hours, but he had to go further, and the next thing we knew, there he was, literally dropping his trousers and saying, you know, the bum, it's hanging down in pleats, and exposing it. So I think maybe in terms of relationships, he painted himself into a corner, and fewer people were phoning back.
And the one relationship that had always worked was also disintegrating, as old age took its toll on Louis.
I'm virtually a prisoner, chained to this elderly derelict, forever reminded of geriatric problems, the stained mattress, the cigarette burns on carpets and chairs, the conversational repetition.
I think that he'd got to a stage where Lou had become a great burden to him. What had been a great friendship and a lot of fun when it was an evenly balanced relationship had become almost like an albatross. I mean, the fact that Lou was becoming incontinent, that he had to do everything for her, that he was feeling pretty ill himself physically, and the fact that the work just wasn't coming as it used to, I think conspired to depress Kenneth to the point that it did.
Kenneth himself wasn't a well man. Stomach ulcers, piles, bowel disorders, all contributed to physical pain he found hard to take.
Walks became more and more infrequent, and when we did go for walks, he would sort of say, "Oh, don't walk so fast. I'm really in pain." What should have taken half an hour would take an hour and a half.
Even this level of suffering was incorporated into his act.
If something is misery-making, turn it, talk about it and make it amusing, make it funny, make it creative, explain why the illness, the malaise occurs. And you can do that with comedy.
He was taking things that were personal and sometimes painful to him, you know, his ailments, his strange voice, his curious manner, and almost sending them up, or not almost, sending them up, so that he was inviting you to laugh at him while he was actually telling you something true about himself.
Mr. Williams.
You have a spastic colon. So I've come into money.
But he would pay a price for this public exposure.
Oh, the fact is, on these chat shows, I've been eating at myself for years, just living off body fat. And people say, all he does now is go on and tell those old stories we've all heard before, with his usual lavatory gags and his camp leather. Pathetic.
He felt he was excavating himself in those chat shows, just giving more chunks of himself away. And I think he felt there wasn't much left of himself.
He'd say, "Oh, I long to be dead." So he said, "I've had enough of this world." So he said, "The pain, the agony, I can't stand it anymore, you know." And I said, "Well, don't talk so silly." I said, "What about all your friends?" And he said, "Well, yes, I'll miss them." But he said, "You don't understand, mate." He said, "The pain is really crippling me."
William's diaries record he had mused on suicide from his earliest days. But in the last few months of his life, the idea of putting an end to his suffering began to obsess him.
What, you mean, like, say, you'd want to kill yourself or something like that?
Oh, yes, I put stuff like down about suicide and how one would go about it, what would be the best method, and all that kind of thing, you know. Looking back on it, of course, it's often, you know, quite amusing.
Why do you think you want to kill yourself?
Well, one would think it at the time because of extremely low state of morale. And one actually does write something down which is practical in terms of how one thinks one should go about it.
Counted my capsules of poison, and I've got over 30, so there should be enough to kill me. Just have to work out the time and the place.
A fortnight before he died, I saw him outside Broadcasting House, and we stood on a traffic island. He was very distressed, and he looked sort of grey, and Kenneth's face in repose sometimes was an incredibly tragic face. And he would go very sallow, and I remember thinking, I was so preoccupied with my own things, and I remember thinking, oh, I should ring him. But I didn't.
On March 21st, 1988, William's diaries reveal that he attempted an overdose, but after taking 2 barbiturates, couldn't go through with it. On April 14th, he wrote what was to be his final entry in his diary.
Had meal with Lou at 5:30. Saw the news, watched the dreary saga of murder and mayhem. By 6:30, pain in the back was pulsating as it's never done before. So this, plus the stomach trouble, combines to torture me. Oh, what's the bloody point?
The next day, Louis went into her son's flat and found him dead in his bed.
The comedy actor Kenneth Williams has died at the age of 62. He was found dead at his flat in North London this morning. It's believed
He died from an overdose of barbiturates, causing much speculation in the press. But the coroner couldn't be sure it wasn't an accident and recorded an open verdict.
It was, if you like, I think a generous verdict. Probably there was doubt in their minds and they just went for the verdict that was the most neutral. It's possible when you've taken a lot of alcohol that you take a lot of pills, I suppose, by mistake. This has happened, but I'm sure it didn't happen to him. This was a perfectly willed act, which he'd contemplated several times at different stages over the weeks beforehand.
I believe that he took his life. That is what I believe. I don't know that for sure, but I believe so. He could not find anything worthy in himself at all. He felt that his life was dross.
At the end of the day, he died, I think, of frustration, really. Sexual, social, theatrical, professional. He just wasn't doing what he wanted to do.
Left neatly stacked in William's bookcase was his final legacy. The 41 volumes that documented his innermost thoughts about himself and everyone who came into his orbit, candid and uncensored.
You say you're not going to want them published after your death. I'm surprised to hear you say that. I'd have thought you might have thought you'd want your diaries published after your death.
Oh, I see. Oh, after death?
Yes.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you meant published during lifetime.
Oh, no.
Oh, after death. Yes, one wouldn't mind that at all.
Wouldn't you worry about being unkind or catty?
No, I wouldn't care at all then. One would be out of the way.
couldn't.
I wouldn't mind it. And then saying, oh, well, he was a rotter, to say a nasty thing like that. I wouldn't mind at all if I was out of the way. That's fine.
He knew that he'd been a strange and somewhat dislocated personality all his life. Since a child he'd known that, and he'd never managed quite to puzzle it out for himself. But I think he wanted to leave the evidence so that it was there on the table, literally on the table, for us to see and sort out.
La plume de ma tante. C'est la vie, ma crêpe Suzette.
I feel sad for him that his life wasn't as happy for him as he made it for all of us. Because as soon as you saw him, as soon as you heard him, your heart lifted, you broke into a smile, and sometimes into a belly laugh. He had the gift of creating laughter, but he didn't have the gift of creating it for himself.
Par avion, pète-tu la glace? Fiancés ensemble, lorgnette, lingerie et de toilette, gauloise cigarette, entourage ma crêpe Suzette.
Bye-bye, and thank you ever so much. It's been really wonderful for you to have me.